Hello everyone, I'm Ixalan, and this is the last video of the full set limited review for Rivals of Ixalan, at least when I'm talking about, individual cards and giving them grades. We've covered all the other colors, now we're looking at the rest. Even after this video, I have several more videos coming out this week about Rivals of Ixalan Limited. I'll be talking about the top 10 bombs in the format, the best commons and uncommons in the format, and making an archetype guide to help show you what each colored pair is interested in doing. Remember, in these videos I use a letter grade system. In the description below you can find a link that'll take you to a video that describes how I come up with these letter grades. For now, let's get started by looking at the first gold card in Rivals of Ixalan. And that is Angrath the Flame Chained, which is a 3 generic, 1 red, 1 black, legendary planeswalker with the subtype Angrath, mythic rare, starts with 4 loyalty, has a +1 loyalty ability that says each opponent discards a card and loses 2 life, has a -3 loyalty ability that says gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap it, it gains haste until end of turn, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next instep if it has a converted mana cost of 3 or less, and it has a -8, the ultimate as we call it. Each opponent loses life equal to the number of cards in his or her graveyard. This is a solid but not game-breaking planeswalker. If you play this when you're ahead, you're going to be in good shape because you can just destroy your opponent's hand while damaging them. From behind it isn't useless because it can steal an opponent's creature for a turn, any creature, and if that creature happens to be small, you also get to sacrifice it, which is good, but he isn't the kind of planeswalker who can effortlessly pull you back ahead from being behind. He doesn't come with removal that doesn't ask any questions. If you're at parity or ahead, though, he can seal the deal for you. Angrath's ultimate is far from the type that means you win the game, though. Sure, it synergizes well with his other 2 abilities, but sometimes it just won't do enough damage. Angrath isn't bad by any stretch. I know I sound down on him, but I sound down on it because I want to make sure people don't overrate him just because he is a planeswalker. Many are completely broken and limited, but Angrath isn't one of them. He's merely good. I'm going to give him a B. He's going to be a first pick in 99% of packs, and splashing him also is definitely worth it as strong as he is, but he's not a bomb. Next we have Cerre, which for 1 generic, 1 green, and 1 white is a 2/3 human druid at uncommon. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, and you can sacrifice it to return a dinosaur card from your graveyard to your hand. This is what they call the signpost uncommon for green-white, which is clearly supposed to be green-white dino ramp. And it's good. The fact that it fixes you for any color and ramps you is great. It allows you to splash. It has decent stats for its costs, too. It's not like they gave us a 2/2. They gave us a 2/3, and it can sacrifice itself to bring back a dinosaur from your graveyard. All of that amounts to this being a first pickable signpost uncommon, I think. A B-. Fixing and ramping and getting extra value if you have dinosaurs is very good. Next we have Azor the Lawbringer, which for 2 generic, 2 white, and 2 blue is a 6/6 legendary Sphinx at mythic rare. It has flying. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent can't cast instant or sorcery spells during that player's next turn. And whenever it attacks, you may pay X, white, blue, blue, and if you do, you gain X life and draw X cards. Yeah, so wow, huh? This is a 6 mana, 6/6 flyer who already basically makes sure that he's going to survive a turn because he says no to your opponent casting instant or sorcery spells during their turn. Granted, they could wait to cast an instant until your turn, but he's definitely reducing the chances of himself dying. And then on top of that, when he attacks, you get to cast Sphinx's Revelation. And that is absolutely insane. If you just casted him, you have 6 mana, so the most you can do maybe is just to gain 3 life and draw 3 cards, but that's insane. If you're attacking with this guy and doing that on the next turn, you're in great shape. If your opponent can't kill this, it's going to kill them between the massive amount of damage it does and the massive card advantage it gives you. This guy is a solid A. It doesn't matter that he's gold. He's a complete bomb. You should first pick him. He is exceedingly difficult to splash, unfortunately for us. But there are a few cards that create 2 treasures, and that makes it a little easier to splash him in those cases. You really want to end up in blue-white, though, if you pick this guy, because, yeah, he's insane. Next, we have Deadeye Brawler, which for 2 generic, a blue and a black, is a 2/4 human pirate at uncommon with Death Touch. It also has Ascend, and whenever it deals damage to a player, if you have the City's Blessing, you get to draw a card. The blue-black signpost uncommon is what this is. It's a 4 mana, 2/4 Death Touch, and that's already good enough for like a C+, I would think. But this comes with the added bonus of drawing you a card every time it does combat damage to a player if you have managed to ascend. Blue-black, and all pirate colors in general, I think, will be pretty good at ascending thanks to treasure. This is also pretty good as a raid enabler, as anything with less than 4 power can't hope to block this effectively, and it of course also comes with the pirate creature type. That said, this signpost uncommon isn't as tribally as many of the others, and as a result I think it's actually a safer early pick in most situations. It's even an okay card to splash, and I think it's just a B-. Next, we have Dire Fleet Neckbreaker, which for 2 generic, a black and a red, is a 3/2 orc pirate at uncommon that says attacking pirates you control get +2/+0. The black-red signpost uncommon wants you to build an aggressive as heck pirate deck, of course, and that's what you can do here. Making it so all your pirates get huge when they attack. By the way, it counts itself. It becomes a 5/2 when it attacks. Is great. And it doesn't, you wouldn't think at first maybe that it affects the board immediately, but if you played a 2-drop and a 3-drop pirate, you play this and then attack with those pirates, you are hitting your opponent incredibly hard, and they're going to be put in some ugly blocking situations. That said, you have to end up in a very aggressive deck. It's pretty weak. It's not a good attacker itself, even as a 5/2. And I don't love it as much as I do some of the other signpost uncommons that I think are strong enough that you're like, well, maybe I should consider going into that color pair. This one instead, you know, it's going to be great in a pirate deck, a black-red pirate deck, but you're not going to really stick your neck out there to get it and jump into the archetype just because of the card. I think it's just a C+. Next, we have Olinda, the Dusk Rose, which for 2 generic, 1 white, and 1 black is a 1/1 legendary vampire knight at mythic rare. It has lifelink. Whenever another creature dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on her, and when she dies, she creates X 1/1 white vampire creature tokens with lifelink, where X is her power. This card's cool, but I'm not actually that high on it. It does some neat stuff, and it is a mythic, so I think people are going to overrate it. The reason I don't like it is because of how small it is to start with. The 4-mana 1/1 really sets you up to get completely blown out by a card like Dual Shot or Lightning Strike, where your opponent is really spending way less mana than you did to cast her. Sure, even if your opponent gets to do that, you are at least left with a 1/1 vampire token, but that's definitely not the scenario you want to go down. However, if she is allowed to stay on the board for any amount of time, she will wreak havoc. Your opponent will be more afraid to trade with your attackers or attack into your blockers because Olinda can become massive, especially in a format with lots of vampire tokens running around. And once she's huge, your opponent is in a lot of trouble because now when they cast a removal spell on her, it's not like they get off scot-free. They don't just deal with 1 vampire token, they are dealing with 5 or 6. Because of all the setup she requires, I'm only going to start her at a C+, which I know seems low, but I have a feeling she will underwhelm more often than be amazing, just because she asks for a certain series of events to happen for her to be at her best, which involves your opponent and you both losing a bunch of creatures before your opponent finds a removal spell for her, which is literally any removal spell in the format, by the way, in the early going when she first comes into play. Next, we have Watley, Radiant Champion, which for 2 generic, 1 green, and 1 white is a legendary planeswalker with the Watley subtype, a mythic rare with 3 starting loyalty. She has a +1 that lets you put a loyalty counter on her for each creature you control. She has a -1 that gives +X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. It's just to 1 creature. And she has an ultimate that's a -8. It gives you an emblem with whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. I have to say, neither planeswalker in this set is the kind that is a bomb and leads to massive blowouts on a regular basis, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Like, there's a lot of planeswalkers where it's like, yeah, I drafted this, if I get it in play, I'm just going to win. Neither of these are quite that good, and in fact, I think Watley is a little worse than Angrath. She can get her loyalty pretty quickly, high pretty quickly in the late game, which is nice, since your opponent definitely doesn't want you getting the emblem. And she can also just make one of your creatures huge for a turn, but this isn't as good as it looks because, sadly, she doesn't grant an evasive ability like Trample. That said, there are plenty of Tramplers and Flyers in green and white that can benefit from the huge stats boost, but keep in mind that, in general, Watley is asking for you to have lots of creatures in play to begin with to be at her best. The best planeswalkers don't need a whole lot of help to be good, and she does. Her emblem, while strong and likely to win you the game over time, isn't the kind that completely destroys your opponent. I actually like her, like I said, a little less than Angrath, and I'm going to start her at B-. She'll be first pickable in a lot of packs, but I would take premium removal over her, and that's an indicator that she's not an incredible planeswalker or anything. Next up, we have Jungle Creeper, which for 1 generic, 1 black, and 1 green is a 3/3 elemental at uncommon, and it has an activated ability of 3 generic, 1 black, and 1 green. Return Jungle Creeper from your graveyard to your hand. I'm pretty happy Black-Green got a Signpost common this time around. In Triple Ixalan, both Black-Green and Blue-White didn't get Signpost uncommons for one reason or another. In triple Ixalan, it felt like an undersupported archetype as a result, though it was definitely about explore and graveyard shenanigans, and this plays into that. I kind of wish it was an explore payoff a little more, because I love explore, but, you know, it's still a fine card. A 3-mana 3/3 is great stats, and it's a real nuisance out of the graveyard since it can keep coming back. It does take quite the investment to return it, but being able to do it at instant speed is pretty nice. It is the kind of card you feel fine about throwing into your graveyard too when you're exploring, since you can get it back so easily. That said, it isn't a powerhouse as a 3/3 that can come back, but for a total investment of 8 mana every time, that's not incredible. It's a nice late game mana sink that can keep you in the game, but it's just another C+ signpost uncommon. You'll play it in that color pair, but it's not going to make you want to get into that color pair in the first place. Next, we have Kumena, Tyrant of a Roscoe, who for 1 generic, 1 green, and 1 blue is a 2/4 Merfolk Shaman, legendary at Mythic, and it has a huge block of text. You can tap another untapped Merfolk you control to make him unblockable. You can tap 3 untapped Merfolk you control to draw a card, and you can tap 5 untapped Merfolk you control to put a +1/+1 counter on each Merfolk you control. Somebody's going to be an awesome EDH general for Merfolk, right? And in Limited, he's good too. He's absolutely insane in a Merfolk deck, basically a Swiss Army knife of a finisher in them. He can become unblockable, draw you cards, and put +1/+1 counters on all of your Merfolk, and those are all crazy. He also starts with decent baseline stats as a 3-mana 2/4. He is powerful enough to first pick, since if you end up in a Merfolk deck, he is just going to end games for you. That said, he isn't really playable anywhere else. While his stats are respectable, you're not going to try to splash him in a deck that doesn't have Merfolk in it, and blue-green is just a Merfolk color pair. So, you know, he's just an F, and you're just not going to play him in any deck that doesn't have Merfolk in it because of the colors he's in. But he's a straight-up A in Merfolk, so he's a very, like, all-or-nothing kind of first pick. If you take him and Merfolk are open, he's going to be incredible. If you take him and they're not, you're going to be like, why didn't I take that Bombard with my first pick? You know, so that is something to think about. Next, we have Legion Lieutenant, which for 1 white and 1 black is a 2/2 Vampire Knight at uncommon, and it says other vampires you control get +1/+1. This signpost uncommon isn't doing anything fancy, it's just a Vampire Lord, which is obviously pretty good. Being a Vampire Lord might be better than being any other Lord in this format because of the presence of the 1/1 lifelink Vampire tokens that are all over the place. Turning those into 2/2s is a massive swing. Obviously, you don't want this in a non-Vampire deck, but it's a B- in a Vampire deck, and is another gold card worth considering first picking because of its upside. Next, we have Merfolk Mistbinder, which is 1 green and 1 blue for a 2/2 Merfolk Shaman at uncommon, and it's a Merfolk Lord. It gives your other Merfolk +1/+1. Just as obviously as the Vampire Lord, this one just wants you to be playing a bunch of Merfolk. Obviously, it's unplayable if you're not, but I also think it's a B-. Merfolk have ways of making tokens, and they're also hexproof, which once hexproof tokens start getting a little bigger, that becomes a lot more of a problem. It's another card that you can take as a first pick in a really weak pack, but it's another card that could end up just being not in your deck at all because of the way this format works. Next, we have Protium Raider, which for 1 generic, 1 blue, and 1 red is a rare 2/2 shapeshifter pirate with raid. Raid is the mechanic where if you attacked, you get to do something. And in this case, if you've raided that turn, it comes into play as a copy of any creature on the battlefield. This is an interesting clone. We haven't ever quite seen one like this. This one makes you attack, and then it gets to come into play as whatever the best creature on the board is. That is an effect that is powerful enough that even just chump attacking and losing a creature can be worth it, as making sure it becomes the best creature in play, whether yours or your opponent's, is pretty scary for 3 mana. This card's great because raiding really won't be that hard, and more often than not, you'll be paying 3 mana for a creature worth way more than that. It also has the complete fail case, like where you're just like, man, I cannot raid, of just coming down and being a 2/2 pirate, which isn't good, but the fact that that's its fail case on top of having a very high ceiling makes it worth a B to me. I am willing to first pick this pirate. Next up, we have Raging Regisaur, which for 2 generic, 1 red, and 1 green is a 4/4 dinosaur at uncommon, and whenever it attacks, it deals 1 damage to target creature or player. This is another strong signpost uncommon. A 4 mana 4/4 is great, and it comes with a powerful attack trigger that is very flexible. You can just poke your opponent for some extra damage, kill one of their X1s, or, what I think it sort of really wants you to do, use it to trigger one of your other dinosaurs that has Enrage. All of those are nice options when they come in the package of a 4 mana 4/4. I'm going to give this a B-. It's another signpost uncommon that in a weak pack I think you can take and see if that color pair ends up being open for you. Next, we have Relentless Raptor, which is 1 red and 1 white for a 3/3 dinosaur at uncommon. It has vigilance, and it says Relentless Raptor attacks or blocks each combat if able. This is a super aggressive creature that can really take over the game if you play it on turn 2. At all other stages of the game, though, he gets to be pretty underwhelming. Having to block every combat means it is usually just going to die when you play it late game. Hopefully you can at least get a trade, but since your opponent knows he has to block, they can find a way to attack that just removes your Relentless Raptor. He does go really well with auras, combat tricks, and sheep removal, all of which red-white is going to be interested in, but still, there's just so much downside here. I think it's just the worst of this set, Signposts and Commons, and I'm just going to give it a solid C. Yeah, you'll play it in your red-white deck, but you know, even then, it's not going to be your best 2-drop necessarily. So I think that makes it sort of a failure as a Signpost uncommon. Next, we have Resplendent Griffin, which kind of looks more like a parrot, but hey, it's 1 generic mana, 1 white mana, 1 blue mana for a 2/2 Griffin at uncommon with flying. It has Ascend, and if you have the City's Blessing, it gets a +1/+1 counter whenever it attacks. So blue-white got a Signpost uncommon here too, when it didn't in the previous set. And it's a solid but not great card. It is a Windrake with upside, which is never a bad thing, but I would have liked to see the card be a little more synergistic with the rest of blue-white somehow. I mean, I guess the idea is that white can make vampire tokens and blue can make treasure, so ascending isn't too difficult. But yeah, I mean, it's still good. A Windrake in the early game and a flying threat that gets larger and larger as the game goes on in the later part of the game. Still, it isn't the kind of gold card that makes you want to jump into the color pair, so I don't think it gets above a C+. Next, we have Siegehorn Seratops, which for 1 green and 1 white is a 2/2 dinosaur at rare with Enrage. And when it gets dealt damage, you get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. There's reminder text here, and I think it's important because some people, might not have realized this is how it would work. It has to survive the damage to get the counters. So this is just a bear with upside, but I'm not sure the upside is actually that good. Sure, it can make 1/1 tokens look laughably bad, but it can't really get damage done to it in most cases and survive. I mean, it's only got 2 toughness, meaning it is really never going to be more than a difficult-to-cast grizzly bear. Sure, there are ways to trigger Enrage yourself in this format, but most of them are actually red, meaning that you have to go outside of green-white, really, to make this card good. Overall, I find this to be pretty underwhelming. I'm just going to give it a C. It's a 2-mana 2/2 with upside, but that upside is minor. With the caveat, it does work well with cards like Pirate's Cutlass and Auras, because it'll be big enough to survive combat damage. I really feel like it's a card that was probably originally like a 2-mana 3/3, in the line of Watch Wolf and the Hexproof Lion guy from Theros, and maybe late in the game they decided to shrink it down to a 2/2 because a 3/3 was too good. It's just a super underwhelming card to me, so I'm just going to give it a C. Next, we have Stormfleet Sprinter, which for 1 generic, 1 blue, and 1 red is a 2/2 human pirate at uncommon. It has haste, and it can't be blocked. The Signpost common for blue-red here makes it clear that you want to be activating raid and you want to be interested in pirates, just like in Triple Ixalan. The fact this is unblockable is great, and imagining it with a Captain's Hook or Pirate's Cutlass is pretty disgusting. It does die to an awful lot of things, but the inevitability it provides you is good. Still, I think it's a cut below the golden commons that really make you want to get into a color pair, and I'm just going to give it a C+. Next, we have Zakama, Primal Calamity, which for 6 generic, 1 red, 1 green, and 1 white is a 9/9 legendary creature Elder Dinosaur at Mythic Rare. That's right, the Elder Dinosaur cycle is now complete, and it has a bunch of text. It has Vigilance, Reach, and Trample, to start with. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, untap all lands you control. Okay, that sounds good. But oh, by the way, he also has a bunch of activated abilities. You can pay 2 in a red to do 3 to a creature, you can pay 2 in a green to destroy an artifact or enchantment, and you can pay 2 in a white to gain 3 life. This thing is nasty if you can cast it. 9 mana is admittedly a ton and probably a little bit dangerous to attempt, but come on, who that opens this guy, when they're just drafting and trying to have a good time, isn't going to take him and try to make it work? A 9 mana 9/9 with all these keywords means that it can block basically everything and effectively attack and block through everything, but the real value comes from its ability to untap all of your lands the moment it comes into play. This, coupled with the slew of activated abilities it has, means that if you cast Zakama, you're going to do some real damage to the board, either by destroying creatures with its damage effect, blowing up problem artifacts or enchantments, or maybe gaining life if that's what you really need to do. Unlike some of the other cards in this set that ask you to pay a ton of mana, like most of the other Elder Dinosaurs, this one does something immediately thanks to the fact that it untaps your lands, making it a safer bet to ramp into. Still, it costs 9 mana across 3 colors, and while I know I'm going to first pick it and try to make it work at least once in this format, I know that it's definitely not optimal. Its prohibitive mana cost makes it so that I can't really give it something more than a C+, though I do advise drafting it just to have a good time and trying to see if you can make it work. Okay, so that does it for the gold cards that are not double-faced. Now we're going to look at the gold double-faced cards, the first of which is Madonnas Climb. Madonnas Climb is 1 generic, 1 green, and 1 blue for a rare legendary enchantment, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Then, if that creature has 3 or more +1/+1 counters on it, transform Madonnas Climb. It then transforms into Winged Temple of rozka, a legendary land. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, and you can pay 1 generic, 1 green, and 1 blue, and tap it to give target creature you control flying and +X/+X until end of turn, where X is its power. So Madonnas Climb, just putting a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control every turn would be an okay little enchantment in a set that has some +1/+1 counter synergies, which this is. And you can definitely play this card without ever intending to transform it, because in some cases that will be better, to sort of spread out the +1/+1 counters. Your opponent can always kill a creature before it lets you transform it into the Winged Temple, and that's pretty annoying. That said, transforming it is strong and can lead to a creature easily one-shotting your opponent in the air. In really +1/+1 counter heavy decks, this can be looked at as ramp too, since you may be able to flip it by turn 4 if you already have some +1/+1 counters around. Still, the setup cost here is fairly steep, and I don't think this is the kind of gold card you want to first pick, as you really have to build around it and be a +1/+1 counter heavy deck for it to be at its best. I'm just going to give it a C+. Next, we have Journey to Eternity, which for 1 generic, 1 green, and a black is a legendary enchantment aura at rare, and it says enchant creature you control. When enchanted creature dies, return it to the battlefield under your control, then return Journey to Eternity to the battlefield transformed under your control, and it transforms into Azor, Cave of Eternity, which is a legendary land. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 3 generic mana, 1 black, 1 green, and tap it to return a creature card from your graveyard directly to the battlefield. Like all the double-faced lands in this set, this is another very interesting one. 3 mana to put a do-nothing aura on one of your creatures doesn't seem great, but if you manage to trade that creature or otherwise have it die, not only does that creature come back into play, let's put it on a Chupacabra, right? It transforms into Azor, Cave of Eternity, which can add mana of any color to your mana pool, which means that if you can play this early and lose a creature early, it is a significant source of fixing as well as ramp, and it has a ridiculously powerful ability to just bring creatures back from your graveyard to the battlefield. Sure, it costs 5 mana, but that is some nice flood insurance, and in the late game, it's really just going to win you the game. It isn't quite a bomb or anything because of all the setup it requires, but I think between the very obtainable fixing and ramping it can provide in the early game and the ridiculous value it can provide in the late game, I'm willing to start this at a B-, where it's probably first pickable in a weaker pack. Next, we have Path of Metal, which for 1 red and 1 white is a legendary enchantment at rare. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each creature that doesn't have First Strike, Double Strike, Vigilance, or Haste. And whenever you attack with at least 2 creatures that have First Strike, Double Strike, Vigilance, and or Haste, transform Path of Metal. It then becomes Metzali, Tower of Triumph, a legendary land that lets you add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. 1 generic, it has 2 activated abilities. One allows you to pay 1 generic and 1 red to tap it and do 2 damage to each opponent. The other lets you pay 2 generic and 1 white to choose a creature at random that attacked this turn, and you destroy that creature. This is a very interesting card. It pays you off for having as many keyword abilities as possible, which is pretty interesting. It is in a dinosaur-heavy color pair where keyword abilities aren't all that hard to come by, and a color pair where Enrage also exists, so even if you do 1 damage to them, you might get some value out of it. Keep in mind that you just need 2 creatures with any of the keyword abilities it mentions. This means that they can both have Vigilance, for example, and it'll still transform. Also note that it doesn't support lifelink. This is probably because they wanted it to destroy vampire tokens, and for this not to be super good in a vampire deck, which it would be. The other nice thing about this card is that if you have any dinos with Enrage, as I said, it's going to get a free trigger off of them. Once it transforms, it becomes another very strong land that will just win you the game if the game goes long, between its ability to destroy creatures and do damage to the opponent. This card is definitely something of a build around, so it both ramps and fixes for you, and you need a combination of lots of creatures with keyword abilities, especially these keyword abilities, and dinosaurs with Enrage to really get the most out of the card. Because it asks so much of you, I don't really feel comfortable giving it anything more than a C+. You'll play it in red-white if you end up in that color pair, certainly, but you're not going to go after it early. Next, we have Profane Procession, which for 1 generic, 1 white, and 1 black is a rare legendary enchantment, and it has an activated ability where you pay 3 generic, 1 white, and 1 black to exile target creature. Then, if there are 3 or more cards exiled with Profane Procession, transform it. It transforms into the Tomb of the Dusk Rose, a legendary land. You can tap it and add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. And you can pay 2 generic, 1 white, and 1 black to put a creature exiled with it onto the battlefield under your control. I like this card a lot. Sure, it takes a while to really get going. In fact, a total investment of 8 mana before you get to exile your first creature, but it ends up being a huge source of card advantage, allowing you to eat 3 creatures. Note that those creatures never get returned to your opponent either, even if they blow up the procession. Once it has exiled 3 creatures, it transforms into Tomb of the Dusk Rose. This one is a little too slow to be thought of as ramp, certainly, but it does provide some late game fixing, I guess, and it has a very powerful ability. You get to start putting the creatures into play that you exiled for only 4 mana. It isn't insane to think you exiled some big creatures with it either. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that opponents can play around this. They know you only get 3 shots with the procession, and to a certain extent they can control what you get to kill with it, thus controlling what you get to put into play with it once it transforms. The high cost of the card and the fact that it can be played around keep me from putting it into the B range. It's also just really slow and clunky, and it's another one of these flip lanes that I'm going to start at C+. Next, we have Storm the Vault, which for 2 generic, 1 blue, and 1 red is a legendary enchantment at rare. And it says, whenever 1 or more creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, create a treasure token. And then it says, at the beginning of your end step, if you control 5 or more artifacts, transform Storm the Vault. Transforms into Vault of Lacan, which is a legendary land, and it lets you add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, or alternatively, you can tap it and add blue to your mana pool for each artifact you control. So this transforms into Tolarian Academy, kind of like Burial Rites of Itlamok transforms into Gaia's Cradle, but this does some decent work before it transforms, providing you with treasure to help you fix and ramp. Still, it is a 4-mana enchantment that does not affect the board in any real way immediately, though you can get treasure off of it right away, of course. And transforming it isn't the easiest thing ever. A lot of the time, you want to cash in those treasures to play scarier things from your hand or to fix your mana. Sure, once it transforms, it can add a ton of mana to your mana pool, assuming you still have treasures in play. But what are you going to do with all that mana in this format? The ideal scenario is one where you already have a couple treasure in play when you play this, and you transform this the turn you play it, and then you are getting a massive amount of ramp, allowing you to play some scary stuff very easily. But that ideal scenario is not going to happen all that often. I think this is the worst of this cycle, and I'm actually going to start it at a D. I think you'll play it if you're desperate for fixing and need those treasures, but there are easier ways to make treasure than this. The next couple of double-face cards are actually artifacts. The first of those is Azor's Gateway, which for 2 generic mana is a mythic rare legendary artifact, and you can pay 1 and tap it to draw a card, then exile a card from your hand. If cards with 5 or more different converted mana costs are exiled with Azor's Gateway, you gain 5 life. Untap Azor's Gateway and transform it. It transforms into Sanctum of the Sun, a legendary land, and all it does is tap to add X mana of any 1 color to your mana pool, where X is your life total. This is a cheap little artifact that lets you loot for 1 mana, basically. And that's a pretty okay deal. If that's all it did, I think it would be a solid playable in the C range, but nothing special. This can also flip into an absolutely ridiculous land, though, that can add tons of mana to your mana pool. But unless you flip this quickly, which is kind of impossible in Limited since it requires you to have cards with different mana costs, 5 different mana costs, then that's hard to do, especially in Limited where your deck really won't have enough cards of different mana costs to make this easy to flip. The massive amount of mana won't really be that useful, and it just won't transform very often, and it definitely won't do it early. As a result, I don't see this as much more than the Azor's Gateway side of the card, which I think just gives it a C. Next, we have Golden Guardian, which for 4 generic mana is a 4/4 artifact creature golem at rare with Defender. It has an activated ability where you pay 2 mana, and Golden Guardian fights another target creature you control. When Golden Guardian dies this turn, return it to the battlefield transformed under your control. It transforms into Goldforge Garrison, which interestingly is not a legendary land, so you can actually have multiples of these in play. It can add 2 mana of any 1 color to your mana pool, and it can pay 4 mana and tap to create a 4/4 colorless golem artifact creature token. So a 4 mana 4/4 with Defender is already like kind of an okay card. It blocks well, it's not easy to attack through. However, to transform this thing, you have to let it fight one of your other creatures. It is going to kill most creatures in this format when it fights it, so is it worth it? And I think the answer is yes, it is. It transforms into a land that not only ramps you up 2 mana, so that's some serious ramping, it can also crank out way more 4/4 golems that will just win the game in the long run. These ones don't have defender. By the way, you can also use the Guardian to fight a creature with Enrage, giving you even more value. Sure, if your opponent is way ahead of you, you won't have time for this. But even if that's the case, they at least have to worry about this huge blocker. Overall, this takes some setup. You need to have another creature in play that can kill Golden Guardian in combat, and ideally you don't want that creature to die, or you want it to have Enrage. But the amount of upside it gives you is just insane, and I think I'm willing to start it at B-. It's colorless, so I don't really hate the idea of first picking it. A fail case of a 4-mana 4/4 defender isn't the worst thing ever either. So, you know, it's worth first picking in some weaker packs. Next, we have Awakened Amalgam, which for 4 generic mana is an artifact creature golem at rare. It has a star for power and toughness, and its power and toughness are each equal to the number of differently named lands you control. This is an interesting design, one that I think has some serious implications for constructed, but here, it doesn't seem like it will be great that often. There aren't a lot of non-basic lands running around here, other than the ones that transform, and they'll ask for a decent amount of setup, and you aren't going to be playing more than 2 colors most of the time. In the vast majority of decks, it is going to be a 4-mana 2/2 or 3/3, which is bad. On the off chance that you end up with non-basic lands galore, including rare ones, it gets to be a little better, but even then you can't guarantee you're always going to get them into play. As a result, I think this is just a card to steer clear from in this format. It's just an F. Next up, we have Captain's Hook, which for 3 generic is an artifact, an equipment at rare. It says equipped creature gets +2/+0, has menace, and is a pirate in addition to its other creature types, and when it becomes unattached from a permanent, you have to destroy it. It does have a very low equip cost of 1. I'm not sure why they did this to us. The common Pirate's Cutlass from Ixalan is just better than Captain's Hook. Sure, this gives some nice stats boost, but 3 is a lot to cast it for, even with +2/+0 and menace on the line. It does only equip for 1 after that, and that's nice, but they also decided to add the line of text that the creature dies if the hook gets removed, so it sort of balances out the cheap cost and the fact that your opponent can easily 2-for-1 you if they blow this up. I'm not sure why they decided to add that line, as this card would be good but not great without it. It's still a playable card and a decent piece of equipment, but it's nothing special. I'm going to give it just a C. It'll be nice in aggressive decks, but Pirate's Cutlass is honestly better. Next, you have Gleaming Barrier, which for 2 generic mana is an artifact creature wall at common. It's a 0/4, it has defender, as all walls do, and when it dies, it creates a treasure token. This provides you with some early blocking, and once it finally dies, it gives you a treasure. Feels like a textbook version of a D to me. You'll play it if you're short on playables or desperate for fixing, but otherwise, steer clear. Next, we have the Immortal Sun, which for 6 generic mana is a mythic rare legendary artifact, and it says players can activate Planeswalker's loyalty abilities, so that one's not that good. But the other 3 are: at the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card, spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and creatures you control get +1/+1. This does a lot of stuff. It's an anthem, it draws you an extra card every turn, and it makes all your spells cost 1 less. And by the way, keep in mind spell here means any kind of spell, including creature spell. It also shuts down Planeswalkers, which will probably not usually be relevant, but hey, it doesn't hurt to have that line of text as well. I think the card is a nice top curve for basically any deck in the format, as it provides so much value. It does cost 6, but it does immediately boost your board, and by the time you untap with it, you're really going to be reaping the rewards. It's going to be giving you extra cards that make it even better that your spells are costing 1 less, because you can cast like 2 cards a turn with more ease. I'm going to start this as an A-. The one downside it has is that it costs 6, but it just is such an amazing, powerful card that will warp the game in your favor if you manage to resolve it and live for a couple turns. So first pickable for sure, one of the best first picks in the format because it's colorless. Next, we have a Rozka Relic, which for 3 generic is a common artifact with Ascend. You can tap it to add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool, and if you have the City's Blessing, you can sacrifice it to gain 3 life and draw a card. This is a mediocre mana rock, but unlike most of them, it can do something in the late game, which is gaining you life and drawing you a card. I don't think you play this card unless you're a super dedicated ramp deck, so I'm going to give it a D. Next, we have Silent Gravestone, which for 1 generic mana is a rare artifact, and it says cards in graveyards can't be the targets of spells or abilities. You can also pay 4 generic mana and tap it to exile it and all cards from all graveyards and draw a card. So this is a sideboard card and not a particularly good one, clearly printed with constructed in mind. There aren't really that many graveyard-heavy strategies in this format, so siding it in will be exceedingly rare. It is an F mainboard and a D sideboard card. It's good against a few random cards in the format, like the Phoenix, who won't be able to bring itself back to life if you have this in play. but there's you know, just a handful of cards it's good against, and that makes it a pretty terrible sideboard card. Next, we have Strider Harness, which for 3 generic is an artifact and equipment at common. It gives an equipped creature +1/+1 in haste, and it has an equip cost of 1. We've seen this before, and it was basically unplayable. I think it might be a little bit better here, as this is a very creature-heavy format, and paying an additional 1 to give a big dino haste sounds like an okay deal, but the upfront mana investment is pretty steep, and you really don't want to actually play this on turn 3 in most cases when you should just be playing a creature. I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt and say it might get played at least a little, and give it a D. Next, we have Traveler's Amulet, another reprint we've seen a lot of. 1 generic mana for a common artifact, and you can pay 1, and sacrifice it to search your library for a basic land and put it in your hand. Traveler's Amulet is always a nice form of fixing. It's also good because you can basically cut a land for every Traveler's Amulet in your deck, since if you have a hand with 5 non-lands, a land, and Traveler's Amulet, you basically have a 2-land hand. The fixing in this format was already pretty good thanks to Treasure, but between the Amulet and Evolving Wilds and the uncommon cycle of lands we'll get to in a moment, it's looking even better in Rivals of Ixalan. This is a C. You'll play it all the time if you want some fixing. Next, we have Arch of Rozka, which is a rare land with Ascend. You can tap it to add generic mana to your mana pool, colorless actually, and you can pay 5 and tap it to draw a card, but you can only do this if you have the City's Blessing. Lands that have powerful activated abilities are nice, because the opportunity cost of running them is low. You're at your mana base a little bit with this one, since it only produces colorless mana, but you are essentially running something that is a vast upgrade over a typical land, because in the late game it gives you an excellent mana sink that just lets you draw extra cards. Most other lands don't do anything in the late game other than make you mad when you draw them. All that said, I don't see myself taking it over like removal or efficient creatures, so I don't think it quite gets into the B range, but I'm going to give it a C+. I mean, I'll pick it up mid-pack and feel pretty good about it. Next, we have Evolving Wilds, which is a common land. We've seen this a ton. You tap it, sacrifice it, search your library for a basic land card, and put it into play. As always, it provides an excellent source of fixing, and even just one of these plus a basic land of the color you are fixing is enough to splash, the color you are splashing, I mean, is enough to splash powerful gold cards. Evolving Wilds is a C+, with the caveat that if you really need fixing, you can go after it even harder. So there's also a cycle of 5 lands in this set that produce 2 colors of mana. Highland Lake for blue-red, Foul Orchard for black and green, Forsaken Sanctuary for black and white, Stone Quarry for red and white, and Woodland Stream for blue and green. These lands are all uncommon, and cycles of lands like this are nice. They're all fine and good for fixing your mana. I don't like going after them super early or anything, but if you have off-color bombs and these lands can go a long way to making your mana better, you should take them. I'm going to give them all a C+. I really think Evolving Wilds is actually about as good as they are in most cases. You'll take them mid-pack and basically never cut them if they're in your colors or in colors you are trying to splash. Well, that does it. We've talked about every single card in Rivals of Ixalan. I've given you my thoughts about all of them sort of individually. There are still more videos to come, though. Tomorrow I will be bringing you guys my picks for the best commons and uncommons in the format, so you can sort of guess what those will be based on this limited review, but it's sort of a more concise video that sort of gives you the highlights in each color of the commons and uncommons. There's also an archetype guide coming on its way and a list of the top 10 bombs. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. Don't forget to subscribe for a bunch more Magic the Gathering content. And don't forget to comment if you disagree with any of my evaluations. Talking about the format is a good way for us all to get better at it. Thanks for watching.